Food Production Podcast. This is episode 86, and this is part 9 of Permaculture Design. I wanted to do a little bit of an update, or a couple of updates to my Permaculture Design series, mainly because I'm right in the middle of taking Jeff Lawton's online course. This is my second PDC, and as you guys know, if you've been listening, I wasn't super happy with the quality of the original PDC that I took. So I decided to take another one, and I can honestly say that I certainly don't regret it. There's a lot of stuff that he's covering, and a lot of things that I didn't fully understand before that I'm just starting to get now, because Jeff Lawton is such a good teacher. But anyway, so I wanted to share some of the stuff that he's taught me on the podcast. Hopefully that'll fill in some of the areas that weren't quite as detailed as I would have liked to, or stuff that I didn't even really cover in the Permaculture Design series. Now, obviously this isn't a Permaculture Design class, but I think it is kind of cool to hear some of the stuff that I'm learning in class, and maybe you'll be able to translate that into some of your designs. So let's talk today about climate and climate zones. So there's basically 3 broad climate zones, and we're talking about the temperate, the tropics, and dry land. And believe it or not, a lot of people think that it'd be awesome to have a tropical climate. You can grow all year long. You can grow all these tropical fruits, and that would be a really easy place to grow. And in fact, that's not the case. Actually, the temperate zones are the easiest to cultivate. So obviously there are benefits to the tropics that don't necessarily apply to the temperate, but as far as production and ease of production, temperate is really, in my opinion, the best climate zone. Jeff actually concurs in that as well. But your temperate, now some of the temperate is going to be a little harder because, for example, your polar zone actually is included in the temperate. So, but your cool temperate, your warm temperate, your cold temperate, your Mediterranean, that's all going to be easier to grow in than the tropics for the most part. You might have some Mediterranean that's bordering on dry land that might be a little bit harder than the tropics, but for the most part, in general, the temperate's going to be an easier zone to grow in. Now, your cold temperate is going to be something like Alaska, and it's going to have your super long days in the summer. You're going to have really deep snows. One thing that's interesting about some of these really super cold climates is you would think, there's no way you can grow anything. You can't grow any vegetables in these really cold climates. And the truth of the matter is you can't grow any vegetables for much of the year. But during the summer, when the day lengths are really long, some of these places they'll have days that are 20 hours long. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to grow an enormous amount of produce in a really short amount of time. So when they have these enormous vegetable contests, you always find that the biggest vegetables, the biggest pumpkins and whatnot that they found were in places like Alaska, or places where they have this super long day length. Now, if you're in a cool temperate, I would consider myself here in Pennsylvania probably to be cool temperate. And we don't have we do have long days in the summer. I mean, it gets dark around 8:30 in the evening in the summertime. I wouldn't say we have deep snows, but we do have some light snow. So I would say we're probably cool temperate here. Warm temperate, you're going to get kind of the 4 seasons, but you're not going to get very much snow at all. It's going to be a rare occurrence. And that might be someplace like Georgia, or even like Alabama maybe. And so that would be considered warm temperate. Now, Mediterranean would be you never get snow in the Mediterranean. Your precipitation, you're looking at the majority of the rain in the temperate zone is going to be coming in the wintertime. Now, obviously, it's also in the spring and fall, but typically your summers are drier and then the cooler periods tend to be wetter. That's basically how it works. So you can sort of bank on that from year in and year out. So you can make some plans for how you're going to do things. For example, if you're going to plant a bunch of trees, you're not going to plant all your trees right at the end of the spring as we're going into the summer dry period, because they're going to need that period to get established in order to do well. Now, if you're planting a bunch of trees, in reality, if you think about it, for example, my zone here, zone 6, we get precipitation in the spring, we get precipitation in the winter, we get a little bit less in the fall, but it's more than in the summer. I would say that probably the best time, if you think about it, to plant these trees would be like the early fall. So it's warm enough to get them established. We get a little precipitation in the fall, but it's not baking hot. And then we have the entire winter for the roots to get established, and then we have the entire spring before we even hit the summer. So you have almost 3 seasons before you hit the dry period, and I think that gives your trees the best opportunity for survival. And a lot of people want to plant in the spring, and a lot of times they don't get around to it until like May, even June sometimes. And by the time everything's in, they're getting hammered with the July and August hot and dry, and then they end up losing a lot of trees. I mean, even, I planted my trees in I think it was like mid-April. I think it was mid-April that I planted them, early to mid-April. And to be honest with you, I would have liked to have planted them earlier or the previous fall, but the timing just didn't work out. And I've lost, at first all the trees leafed out, but now that it's gotten a little bit hotter, I've lost a few trees. So I've probably lost, 12 to 15 of the, 200 or so trees, 150 trees or so. So, that's, probably 7% loss, which is, fairly substantial, more than I would like. I'm probably going to be replacing those trees this fall with nitrogen-fixing trees, but so that's a good lesson as far as when you can plant. Another thing to think about is when you would chop and drop. So if you're doing if you're building a food forest and you're chopping and dropping your nitrogen fixing trees, think about it logically. Do you want to chop those trees down at a time when think about what's happening. You're releasing that nitrogen into the soil. Is the surrounding vegetation going to benefit from that nitrogen in the middle of the summer when it's really hot and dry, and that excess nitrogen can actually, in the chemical form, if you were to go out and spread high nitrogen fertilizer on your lawn, you did it in the middle of the summer and dry, you wouldn't do that because it would burn the lawn. Most people know that. So same thing with your chop and drop. You don't want to, now it may not kill the plants, it probably won't, but it's not good for them. So ideally, you chop and drop after the dry season before the wet. So, you could chop and drop in the early fall, you could chop and drop, in the winter time, you could chop and drop in the early spring, but definitely don't do mid to late spring. Obviously don't do it in the middle of the summer. So definitely something to think about for that. The temperate climates are very good for tree growing systems. So that's an excellent place to grow your tree growing systems. It's also a good place for, not that I'm a huge fan of your annual cropping systems, but I do have an annual cropping system here where my Zone 1 garden, I have a lot of annual crops that I grow, and most people do like to have an annual garden. And the temperate zones are very good for annual cropping systems because there's deep soils. And one of the bad things about annual cropping systems is that it's a problem if you destroy the soil. An annual cropping system, it's much easier to destroy the soil than a perennial cropping system. So given that here in the temperate we have deep soils, so up to 60% of the biomass of the soil, or of the biomass of the temperate climate, is above the soil, and we have 40% is below. So that's a lot of biomass in the soil. So that gives us ability for the landscape to recover a little bit better from our annual cropping systems. The bad thing is it's allowed us to basically continually degrade the environments here in the temperate system, but yet still get a crop yield. So we're almost emboldened to continue to do it. One day we'll have another Dust Bowl, and then maybe we'll find religion on destroying these soils. Another interesting characteristic is that the animals, there are a lot of animals that live in the ground, and I can certainly attest to that. The ridiculous amount of groundhogs we have around here, but there are animals that actually live in the ground. But if you went to the tropics, the animals, there's not much as far as the animals living in the ground because of all the water, and also there's a lot of earthworms in the temperate climate, where in the tropics there's not. So just because of the amount of water, the animals can actually drown, which is just kind of interesting. Difference between the tropics and the temperate. Now, your growing period obviously is going to be the spring, summer, fall. We start to taper off, and there's the dormant period is going to be in the winter. And another good thing about the temperate zone, and this is not exactly true as you get down to the warm temperate, but the light is gentler. You got that long daylight in the summer, but the light's gentler than in the tropics, and definitely gentler than in the dry land, where the sun just beats down on everything. But again, the temperate, absolutely the best zone for for cultivation, for growing things. And I personally like tree growing systems here. And you can also have annual cropping systems. You just got to make sure that you're mulching the systems and taking care of the soils, so you're not you're not eating into that soil bank that's so generous here in the temperate zones. Another nice thing about the temperate zone is in the winter, if you think about it. I mean, I remember making a comment when we get a mild winter. I'm like, oh, we know the bugs are going to be really bad next year, because if you get a really strong cold winter, it basically freezes out a lot of the bugs, and it helps us to basically have a little bit more of a balanced system as far as the insect problems are concerned. But I've noticed that when we have a milder winter, the insect problems tend to be harsher, once they come out of dormancy. But which would reason to say that if you're in the tropics, there is no dormant period. So it's a constant battle there. You can't just say, oh well, this was a bad year, I'm going to start over and everything's going to start fresh next year, and next year is going to be better. So that's the nice thing about temperate. It gives you that fresh new start, and you can kind of restart. Now with the tropics, we're talking wet, typically wetter conditions. So you've got the subtropics, the wet and dry tropics, the equatorial tropics, which are going to be close to the equator, your wet tropics, and they do have dry tropics, which are tropics that are in the tropical zones, but they're in dry lands. So, but typically the tropics are very wet, and the precipitation is backwards from the temperate zone. So your summer, instead of your summer being dry, your summer is moist and your winter's dry. Now Panama is actually kind of a wet and dry tropics, and Panama has a wet and dry season. Now there's other parts of Panama that has wet tropics where it's kind of like rainforest. But Panama was interesting when we lived there because we had a very, very pronounced wet and dry season. I mean, in the wet season, it would rain pretty much every day. I mean, every day it would rain, and we're not talking like a little bit of sprinkles. I mean, we're talking downpour. And we used to go out in the rain all the time because nobody wanted to stay inside all the time. We actually used to go. We used to call it mudsliding, and we would go to. There'd be places where the rainwater was. The rain was so hard that this rainwater would be rushing down these hills almost like a waterfall. And so we'd get on these little little boards. We made these boards out of wood, and we'd get on these boards and ride them down, or we'd find these long puddles. And we'd go skimboard, and we'd throw the boards down and jump on them and ride across the long puddles. So we'd do all this stuff, and That was a lot of fun. Yeah, that's how I got ringworm when I was a little kid. Being in all this nasty rainwater everywhere. But that's what we did. I mean, that was a lot of fun. I remember when I was I think I must have been 12 or 13, and football season was typically during it was towards the tail end of the rainy season, and so by that time everything was just muddy and it would rain like crazy. And after practice, a lot of times we'd jump in these enormous rain gutters, and these rain gutters along the street would be probably about as deep as a person. And they would flow so fast, and they would actually go underneath the street. And so we would jump in with our pads, and our pads would help us to kind of float in the water, and then we would ride the rainwater underneath the street. I mean, you talk about stupid. I mean, that's now that I think about it, it's like if we really got a gusher, you could get caught underneath the street, you could drown. I mean, but we were all, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's a different time and a different place, but definitely the summer rains were very, very powerful, and the winter dry was equally as powerful. I mean, there was no rain whatsoever. The ground would be cracking, and it would look like death, and it would never rain. And it would still be warm, of course, and the temperatures would be anywhere between 78 to 88 pretty much all year round. And it'd be relatively humid, and it's definitely a different the climate. Living in the temperate and also living in the wet and dry tropics, it definitely changes how people live quite a bit. It changes how the houses are built. It changes your activities. You do different things at different times. The tropics tend to be pretty good for aquaculture, because we've got a lot of moisture there. Some of the drier places, it's a little harder on the aquaculture, but tropics tend to be better for aquaculture. Tree growing systems tend to be a little bit more difficult to establish. Not to say you can't do it; you absolutely can. But and the annual cropping systems are definitely. I would do aquaculture, and I would do some tree growing systems way before I did a bunch of annual cropping systems in the tropics. Not to say that you can't do it, but I would prefer those other systems, and mainly because the soils in the tropics are very, very shallow, and so your annual cropping systems are going to be a little bit tougher. So they do have some nice soil at the top, and then it really is quickly into just your base subsoil after that. The majority of the biomass, and according to Jeff Lawton, it's like 90% of the biomass is above ground, and so we've only got a 10% humus layer, or I guess not humus layer, but 10% of the biomass being below ground. Like I said before, your animals are not going underground like they have in the temperate. I mean, it's just too much moisture for them to have a home that's going to be anything that would be substantial. Another thing that's interesting is that you're going to get really fast decomposition. I mean, it's wet, it's humid, it's warm, so everything decomposes really, really fast, and so everything cycles really, really quickly. And there's this growth that happens all year, and it will slow down in the drier seasons, but for those places that don't really have the tropics, that don't have a wet and dry so much, we're talking a lot of constant growth. So I would imagine, I've never done a garden down in the tropics, but I would imagine that it would be difficult to keep a place relatively weed free. I mean, everything's just growing so fast and just continually. I would think the maintenance would be a little bit more difficult than in the temperate zones. You're going to get another thing that's interesting, and this is why your aquaculture is good. I mean, that's why you see the rice paddies, and that's why you see, in a lot of Asian cultures, they're so good at doing aquaculture. Is a lot of the nutrient is actually in algae and mud and with the water. So so there is some really good aquaculture that can be done in this zone. The third, climate zone that we've got is drylands. And the drylands, the tropics are humid, whereas the drylands, they tend to have, obviously they don't have the moisture like we do in the tropics, but they also have really high evaporation. So shading things is going to be so important. So if you're planning on doing a pond in a dryland situation, it's going to be really, really important that you have shade, so we can avoid that, so you don't have your pond evaporating all the time. And in the drylands, you're talking, the drylands can be the tropics. It can be the hot tropics that are dry. It can be cool, or it can be cold. So drylands can exist in cool, cold, and hot climates, but the characteristic is that they're obviously the moisture is not there. And what's really interesting about it, and I didn't really think about this much before taking this class and some of the stuff that Jeff talked about with the drylands are, it's not like, when I think of the drylands, I think of the desert, and I think, oh, this place is, it's death. I mean, there's nothing growing. It's, it would be unbelievably hard to do anything in the drylands. And yeah, I to a certain extent, that's probably true. But there actually are some benefits in the drylands that I didn't really think about before. First of all, the soils are decent. I mean, they're not, maybe not quite as good as the temperate, but definitely better than the tropics. And the other thing is the nutrient level of the soil is actually really good. And then you'll also get nutrients coming in with the wind. It's blowing the nutrients around. So I mean, you can use windbreaks. You can try to collect that stuff. And anyways, so the big thing obviously here is if you can solve the water issue, then you can have a productive system. You can have a very productive system in the dryland. Now, it's very easy to destroy it, just like in the tropics. It's easy to degrade that, but it's even worse in the drylands as far as degrading the system. In the tropics, if you degrade the system, it will recover quickly because the cycles are so fast. But in the drylands, the cycles are so slow that if you destroy the soil or you destroy the system, then it's going to take a long, long time, if ever, to come back. It's very easy to take a dryland to desert if you don't manage it properly. So a couple interesting things about the drylands. Yeah, again, we have that really high quality nutrient that's available, and we have decent soils. If you can figure out the water, so you're talking, you could do swales, you can do tree growing systems that on swales to try to get the shade. You're going to want to basically grow everything in the shade to avoid that evaporation, to avoid getting hammered by the heat and the sun. You can do all sorts of trellising and shade systems around your house. You can actually have your housing beneath the ground where it's cooler. If you're growing systems, you can. Whereas, like if you're doing like a contour garden, like if you're doing your double reach contour garden, and in the temperate, you probably have the raised part you're planting and the lower part where your walkways are. Whereas in the dryland, it's going to be backwards. You're going to have the raised part your walkways, the lower part be your cropping system. So that way you have the runoff from the water will go into the lower cropping systems, and then they're going to benefit from being lower in that lower microclimate. That's going to keep it cooler. But and then windbreaks play a big part because you can get erosion from the wind, and that's pretty important. But the swales are big in the drylands because you get a lot of times you'll get these enormous in the drylands. Sometimes you can get the majority of your rain in one event. So you'll have one enormous rain event, and then you'll get nothing after that, or you'll get just a couple little rainfalls after that. So if you can develop a system that can catch all that water and hold it and disperse it slowly over time, you're going to do much, much better than having that water just wash through. So that's your basic climate zones, and let's get into some of the more specific traits, or some specific things that affect the climate in some of the things that will affect your microclimate, or some of the effects to climate, things like altitude. And this is something from Jeff Lawton here. He said that he actually said for every 100 meters, but for every 300 feet up, it's basically like moving 1 degree latitude away from the equator. So for every, which is really, really interesting if you think about it. So if you're up 300 feet on a mountain, that's like moving 1 degree north or south of the equator, depending on what hemisphere you're in. And what you would say, that could be good or it could be bad. It's actually not great, because even if, for example, let's say you moved up, let's say you're like 3,000 feet above sea level, and so you're looking at going 10 degrees latitude up, and it's like, now I can grow the plants that exist in this 10 degree latitude up area. So the problem is your day lengths don't change. So a lot of times those crops won't necessarily flower. So it kind of puts you in a zone where it limits the plants that are going to thrive in that area. So having said that, I mean, there are certain plants that do better in higher altitudes. For example, you'll find a lot of potato farms will be on tops, hilltops, mountains. In Altoona, they actually have a potato farm up there. And the reason they do that is they found that the potato blight and some of the disease that affects potatoes so badly, because the potato, and one of the reasons why they had the potato famine in Ireland is because they had this disease with the potatoes, and unless you have a fresh batch of potatoes every year, and it has to come from somewhere, eventually the potatoes start to succumb to this disease. So if you're growing up high, this disease doesn't do well up in high altitudes. So you'll find some of these potato farms up in high altitudes that do really, really well. So that's kind of an interesting effect. So sometimes you'll find your altitude. So you sort of have to make the problem your solution, like the old permaculture adage. So there are certain things up in altitude that that will work better, but in general, I think it definitely makes it more challenging. There's also what's called a rain shadow, and rain shadows are kind of interesting. It's like you have like a large hill or a mountain, and one side a couple things can happen. You'll have the prevailing wind come across, and it'll collect the warm, moist air, and it'll either push the rain cloud over the mountain and rain on the other side, in which the rain shadow would be, the beginning or the dry side of the mountain, or all the rain will hit before it hits the mountain, and then once it hits the mountain, it breaks the clouds up, and then your rain shadow's on the other side of the mountain. So basically what ends up happening is these large hills or mountains, you have one side that's very moist, and then the other side that's very dry. So that's something to think about. So if you're in like a valley somewhere, and you're like, I wonder which side of the rain shadow I'm on. So depending on what your climate is, you probably want to be in the place that gets rain. if you can choose it, I would say 9 times out of 10 you're going to want to pick the place that gets rain. Maritime effect is also kind of interesting, and this makes a lot of sense. I mean, you see it all over the world, and one of the reasons why people live so much. I mean, a bulk of the population lives on coastlines. Obviously, you have the benefits of the sea and the fish, and all the aquaculture that can happen. You have got all the the river deltas, and you've got the estuaries. All that stuff is really high productive area. But the other thing is the maritime effect will. When you're next to a large ocean, a large body of water, it can actually moderate the climate. So if you're on a coastline, the annual temperatures tend to change a lot less, which means that the cold time and the warm time are going to be closer together. So that moderating effect is usually good for people, and it's usually good for cropping systems. Now, there are negatives to being too close to the ocean as well. I mean, obviously, if you have if you have heavy winds that are coming in off the ocean that are bringing the salt and the sand, and you've got to have good wind breaks, and there's certain plants that are resistant to that stuff, and then other stuff that just get destroyed by it. The soils tend to be sandy, which isn't very good for growing things. So so obviously, being near a large body of water is good for moderating temperature, but as far as for growing things, if you're too close, that can be a problem too. Let's talk about a little bit about microclimates, and this is something we've talked about quite a bit, and this is also something that can affect climate, obviously. But a microclimate is, we're not talking about like a maritime effect or rain shadow or altitude, which affect big areas. Microclimates can be something so small that affects something right in your yard. Just like you might get shelter from your house. For example, I have my best lettuce patch that I've been picking lettuce from this patch forever, and I didn't even plant it, but it grows kind of in the back corner, and it's sort of shaded by 3 walls, and so it gets this really heavy amount of shade. And lettuce, it does nice in dappled shade, and the lettuce is really mild, not bitter at all, and so that's so that's a little microclimate that that the lettuce really likes. There's a lot of microclimates that you can get. You have sheltered areas from your winds. You have other areas that are wide open. You have slope. Or even like little. Let's say your chicken digs a hole in part of your pasture or part of your food forest. That little hole is now a microclimate. It's other things or plants that are growing in that lower, that little hole where moisture is going to pool. You're going to have a little microclimate there. It's going to be cooler there. It's going to be wetter there. An area that's if you built a hugelculture bed, so that area at the top of the hugelculture bed, it's going to tend to be drier. It's going to tend to be warmer. So that's a microclimate. If you build a sun trap, you've got let's say for example, I have my hugelculture beds that are shaped in kind of like a horseshoe pattern, and they're facing true south, so that the sun comes in and it's caught in the middle of that hugel bed. I've got some shrubs planted along the top, and that area in the middle is kind of a microclimate, safe from frost, and it's going to be a little bit of a warmer area to grow things. So there's all sorts of microclimates that you can observe on your property. They already exist. You just have to sort of look around and think about it, and you probably can find things. And then you can also obviously create them, which is kind of cool too. Let's talk about the continental effect. Now, the continental effect is kind of the opposite of the maritime effect. Whereas you get closer to the ocean, it's a moderating effect. The temperature swings are not as bad. You get farther into the continent, far away from the ocean, you tend to have a much wider range of temperatures. So you might have some desert areas that get to be super cold at night, might be freezing at night in the winter time, and then in the summertime, you're getting temperatures well over 100 degrees. So you have this huge temperature range of having to deal with. So that would be a very, very challenging place to grow anything. Can you imagine you're in a dry land where you're in the middle of the continent, far away from ocean, so there's enormous temperature swings, and then there's also extreme dry, extreme heat, extreme cold. It's it's amazing they get anything at all to grow in those situations. So the interesting thing about these things, like your altitude, your miles away from the ocean, you can actually find what's called climate analogs. And a climate analog is where you have a place that, let's say wherever you are, there's going to be another place halfway around the globe that has the exact climate that you do, and that would be a climate analog. And it may not be that they're the exact same longitude and latitude. You're going to probably be close, but that can also fluctuate based on. Actually, you are going to have the matching latitude and longitude, but it could be that, for example, let's say you're 2 degrees north of the equator, your climate analog could be 2 degrees south of the equator. So you're going to have the same degrees away from the equator for the most part. And then you're also going to have the same altitude. So if you're 300 feet up, you're looking for another place that's 300 feet up. That's also X miles away from the ocean. So you put all that together. For example, let's say here, we're however many degrees from the equator. If I find another place that's similar, I figure out how high above sea level we are. We find another one that's similar, how far away from the ocean, and you can find some other place around the globe that's exactly the same climate as you. It might not be exact. The west coasts tend to be drier than the eastern coasts, but for the most part, you're going to find stuff that's going to be almost exact to what your climate is. And the benefit of doing that is your climate analog. You might find that the people there are doing things differently than maybe what you're doing. You might find that they're doing some really cool things, growing some things that you could bring to your climate and say, wow, that really works. I think that's a great idea. That would add diversity to my system, or I like the way they're doing this and I'm going to do this as well. So that's kind of the nice thing about that. So you can literally design in other parts of the world just by using the climate analogs. So let's talk a little bit about your landscape profiles. And what's interesting about landscape profiles is your major landscape profiles are going to be the humid landscape and the arid landscape. And then there's a bunch of minor ones, volcanoes, high islands, low islands, coastlines, estuaries, things like that. So let's talk about the two major landscape profiles. And this is kind of interesting. Your humid landscape profile is going to be, we're talking places that have rounded hills, that got mountains. And one thing, this is really kind of interesting, and this is, Jeff Lawton taught me this. He said that every hill slope or valley has a midline key point. And and what's interesting about the key point is that, the key point tends to be roughly mid-slope. But what you'll find is that above the key point, it's going to be steeper. That basically the area from the ridge is the top of your hill or your mountain, and above, from that ridge down to the middle of the hill or the mountain is the key point. And that area from the key point up to the ridge, that area tends to be steeper than the area from the key point down to the valley. And typically, people are starting there. A good place to start your swales is at the key point. So that's kind of a, if you're designing a system, on a hillside, it's not a bad place to start your design as first thinking about, okay, let's find a key point, and then we'll go ahead and install our swale there. And so that's kind of an interesting thing about the humid landscape, having all these rounded hills and mountains. Now, your arid landscapes, they don't really tend to have as many rounded type hills. They tend to be more angular. I guess from what Jeff says is they're formed from strong winds, which form these more angular type landscapes. And if you're in an arid landscape profile, you probably don't want to be damming things up. You don't want to be having lots of ponds and things like that, unless you can really shade it. One thing that is done in these really arid landscapes is they use gabions, which instead of building a dam, a place you would normally dam something up, they might build a gabion instead. And a gabion is basically like it's like almost like a rock wall across as a dam, and it basically leaks water and gathers silt. So this kind of like, so when you get these huge rainfall events, it holds the water and lets it soak slowly, so that way it doesn't go away. And again, it's not. And this is what another thing I learned from Jeff, and he says this all the time. It's not how much water you have as much as how many times you can use it. So if you have a gallon of water and you use it once, that's all you have. But if you have a gallon of water and you run it through your system 5 times, then you've got 5 gallons of water. So in the arid landscapes, it's so important. Evaporation is huge. You really want to work with shade. The whole idea of using gabions is really interesting. If you're going to do ponds and things like that, you definitely want to do a good job shading them. Now, your minor landscape profiles, so your major ones, talking humid and arid. Now, we've already talked about climate, but this is landscape profiles, slightly different, but similar in a lot of ways. Your minor landscape profiles, you're talking about things like volcanoes. And this is something that very few of us are probably going to come into contact with. I can't imagine. I mean, they're out there, though. Obviously, people are living, in and around, not necessarily in, but right around volcanoes. And obviously, the most famous, in my opinion, is probably Hawaii. So your volcanoes, you're going to have these steep slopes. You're going to have you actually have a pretty fertile soil at the base, and that's from like all the lava. And the soils tend to be very, very alkaline. That's from all the ash. And you can actually do some interesting systems in a volcano. And one famous sort of traditional system is the Ahupua, which is in Hawaii. And these systems, basically, what's kind of cool about them is they sort of divide the land running from the mountains to the sea. They're kind of divided, and they use the streamlines. So what they'll do is they tend to keep the upper mountains pretty forested as best they can. They're not up there cutting things down because that would cause some massive problems for their downslope systems. But so basically, they try to divert the water to these valleys, and they'll grow. In the mid slopes, they're growing like koa and ohai and kukwai trees, and they're doing all that stuff. And I apologize. I'm sure these terms I'm using, I'm sure I'm way off as far as the pronunciation, so I'm doing the best I can with that. So your upper parts are going to be forested, and then once you get the mid-slope, they're going to start growing some productive trees, and then towards the bottom they might start growing things like taro and sweet potatoes, and then once you get more towards the bottom, they're going to be growing, they're going to be doing aquaculture, and then they've got their fishing off the coast. But it's kind of an interesting system, and it's a sustainable system that the traditional Hawaiians developed to live on these volcanoes. But anyway, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Jeff Lawton talked a lot about this system, and I thought that was kind of cool. But the main thing I took away from that, and you kind of see this everywhere, is that you really want your tree systems up high on the slopes, because that's going to be your most stable systems, because those you don't want your upper slopes to be unstable. It'll cause erosion. It's going to cause problems for everything downslope. So ideally, you have your tree systems up high. Let's talk about high islands. And high islands are, a lot of times they can be half moist or half wet and half dry. And that has a lot to do with the rain shadow that we already talked about. So your high islands are going to run into that rain shadow effect. And the high islands a lot of times are made of basalt or granite, and they've got rock walls and caves. And I mean, think about like these beautiful pictures you see where they have a house sitting on a really high rocky ridge, and so those are like things that you classify as like a high island. And you're going to have caves, and you're going to have lagoons and things like that. But anyways, I don't really have much experience with high islands, so that's about all I know is what I'm sort of learning in class. But I can't imagine that it would be super easy to grow on a high island when it's such a rocky system. But I'm sure it's done. So low islands are interesting too. Low islands, you're talking about coral reef or sand islands that are going to be at sea level. And the interesting thing about these low islands is they have a freshwater lens at the center of the island. And basically, you don't go down very deep, a few, maybe 3 meters or so, 4 meters, and you hit this freshwater lens. And the thing is about this freshwater lens is it's so important that you don't destroy it. Because if you destroy the freshwater lens, you basically destroy the life-giving system of that island. So if you're doing toilets, you can't dump your sewage into the lens of freshwater. You've got to do composting type stuff. You've got to be really, really careful not to pollute that. You got to be careful not to over irrigate or pull water from that. You got to really think. You got to be really smart about how you design a system in a low island. And typically, there's not much as far as mountains and whatnot. So there's not going to be a lot of rainwater catchments. So you're definitely going to want to do. Or when I say there's not a lot of rainwater catchments, there's not going to be a lot of water coming off the mountains. But you're going to want to use water tanks. We were in Denise and I were in Bermuda, and I believe Bermuda is that's definitely a low island, and water is a major problem there. I mean, it's a major, major problem. They probably import a ridiculous amount of bottled water, which is terrible, terrible, terrible for the environment. But you have all the tourists, and the tourists are probably soaking up a lot of water with showers and everything else. But everybody had rainwater catchment on their house. So that's going to be when you're designing a system in a low island, you definitely want to have water tanks for rainwater catchment. That's going to be really, really, really important. Another thing is you're going to have pretty strong winds from the ocean, and so your windbreaks are going to be really, really important, to protect that plant material. And the one thing you can do, and I talked about this before, was I think it was a couple weeks ago. I talked about pit gardens, and pit gardens are something that you can definitely do in the low island situations. So you'll dig down and you mound up the material, and you put your organic material in the middle, and you kind of grow your cropping systems in a circle, and you can even grow in the middle, and as your ground covers type stuff, and the lens of water will keep that moist. So there are things you can certainly do cropping as far as a cropping system goes in the low island, but definitely a challenging, very, very challenging to grow on a low island. Now flatlands are pretty interesting, and sometimes you'll have people say, "Oh, well, I wish I had a sloped land because that's what it seems like permaculture looks always like. You're having, you're building these swales on a hill, and you're doing all this cool stuff on a slope." But that's absolutely not true. Flatlands are actually easier. The reason why I think permaculture, they tend to highlight these systems on a sloped land, and I have a south-facing slope. I've got a sloped land. But it's not easier. Flatland would be easier. There's a reason why your farmers want to have the flatland systems. So so your flatlands are good. I mean, it's absolutely nothing wrong with having flatlands. Now, you're not going to have much gravity fall for water. So a lot of people think there's no point in doing swales. But the truth of the matter is, nothing is completely flat. It's impossible. So there's always going to still be some opportunity for swales. Now, you can have your swales much further apart, because when you put your swale in, you're going to actually be catching a lot more water behind the swale than you would in a sloped land situation. So actually a swale can actually be more effective in a flat land situation than in a slope situation. If you're building a dam, or not a dam, if you're building a pond, I'm talking in Australia terms now, because I've been immersed in the permaculture design class, and in Australia they call a pond a dam, whereas obviously here we call a pond a pond. But sometimes I find myself saying a dam when I mean a pond. So if you're going to build a pond, you're not going to have to build these big dam walls because it's flat. So you end up with a lot of excess material. And they actually, they actually provided us with a picture. My class provided us a picture with a kind of a system for a flatland. And basically what they did was they built a swale, and with a tree system on the swale with kind of a pond in the middle, and they used the extra material to make an earth bank behind the house to shelter it from the cold wind, and they positioned the pond to get reflective sun into the house. Kind of a cool little system, but that's something that you could do with the extra soil you pull out of a dam or a pond out of the flatlands. You can certainly make berms with them. You can make earth banks. You can build windbreaks with them. So there's lots of things you can do with that extra material. Wetlands, obviously have a very, very high amount of water, and typically it's 59% water to 40% soil or so, according to Jeff. And wetlands, obviously, if you've got that much water, we're talking pretty good systems for aquaculture. It's already sort of set up. We're working, with nature. We can do a good job with aquaculture. Now, pretty difficult for vegetable production. Although I imagine you could probably do some stuff with hydroponics or aquaponics and get a decent, vegetable crop. But another system, which I think this is really interesting, and I think I talked a little bit about it before, was the Chinampa system. And Chinampas are kind of like canals. And what ends up happening is you create a lot of edge, and you have your aquaculture in the canal, and you have your cropping systems on the land. A lot of times these Chinampa systems were actually inside ponds. So you have a big lake or a pond, and then you have these edges where they're building these little Chinampas, and you also find these a lot in. Originally, I think they originated in South America, but you'll find them in Asia as well. But apparently, the Chinampa system is the most productive system ever created by man. So I can imagine that they're tremendously labor intensive, but extremely productive as well. Estuaries. Now, estuaries are another minor landscape profile, and an estuary is basically where the ocean meets the river, and so we have all this interaction there that creates a tremendous amount of life. So think about the river deltas and things like that. And there's usually not much you can do here, because a lot of times these areas are very, very protected, but they could be extremely productive. So if you could do some sort of system here. Obviously, we're talking aquaculture, but you could definitely do something as long as you're doing it sustainably. But you could certainly use like high tide ponds, and you could catch and raise fish and mollusks, and you could grow seagrass, and there's lots of things that could be done. But most people don't live on a river delta, and they're not doing too much work in estuaries. But it certainly could be a productive system. Coasts. Well, I talked a little bit about the coastal zones earlier, but one of the issues, obviously, we have those heavy winds, and we're bringing in all that salt, which is obviously not good for the plants. So you're definitely going to want to have good windbreaks. You're going to want to plant things that can deal with the alkaline soil of your coastlines. And I think very, very, very challenging to grow a productive system on a coast. I think that just given the heavy winds and the salt and all the sand and the alkaline soil, I think very, very difficult. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. I'm going to continue with this series. I'll probably have another maybe 4 or 5 parts to this. So I look forward to everybody hopefully tuning in to the subsequent episodes. Anyways, that's going to be it for today. Thank you for listening to the Food Production Podcast.